Now, when George and Sarah reached out, they said to me, there's a range of topics around legumes that we want to cover. People are interested in selection of legumes, persistence of legumes, all of these different questions about how we can maximise productivity and persistence. Now, the problem for me is that's a formidable amount of content to try and get through. So what I'm going to do this morning is give you a really quick overview, snapshot, highlights of the key things we need to be looking for. Now, what I'll be touching on are learnings from a range of projects. So I've done a fair bit of work with legumes in terms of nutrition, particularly phosphorus, so managing our legumes for phosphorus in both temperate and tropical pasture systems. I'm currently involved with an adoption and extension project at the moment. And so what I'll be doing is just highlighting from across those range of projects some of the key things that I think are quite valuable, and hopefully it can generate a bit of discussion as we go through. For those of you who are growing legumes and you're well on the way down that path, I'm hoping what I'm saying today will just confirm what you understand. For those of you who are a bit new to the legume game, I'm hoping what I talk about will raise a few questions. So you can start thinking, well, what is it that we're actually aiming for? Now, to give you a bit of an overview of where I want to get to start off with, I want to try and set a bit of a basis and ask the question, why legumes? Why are we interested? And I'm sure everyone will just say, well, we know why we're interested. Legumes provide quality. Legumes fix nitrogen. So we're quite interested in incorporating a component to the pasture which is really useful for our system. The thing though, when I ask that question, why legumes, why is it that we keep asking to know more and more about legumes? What is it that is the challenging points? Because quite often, I think nearly every year, there's some interest in legumes. Productivity, persistence, how do we graze them, how do we fertilise them? There's always questions coming up, and that's why we need to answer that question, why legumes? I then want to touch on this idea of fighting to survive. Now, I'm a pastures lecturer. I'm very interested in the feed base. When we think about the feed base, as Carol's been talking, as I'm thinking about pastures, we've got a diverse mix of species that are fighting to survive. They're fighting for limited resources. How they fight and how effective they are at fighting for those resources is largely going to determine how successful they are. If we know that, we can start to answer some other questions. So those first two key points are all about context. I'll try and get through that pretty quickly. And then we'll get on to three key things: legume selection, establishment, management. I've got 20 minutes. We all know we're not going to get to the depths of all of these things. But what I'm wanting to do is just highlight a few of the key components. Why I want to focus on each of these three, though, is to talk back to my title. When we're interested in productivity and persistence, for me, I think we need to be ticking the boxes for selection, for establishment, and for management. If I don't select the correct species, it's not going to be productive or persistent. If I don't establish it effectively, I'm not going to have a productive legume. If I don't manage it effectively in terms of grazing and fertilising, I'm not going to have a productive or a persistent sward. So I don't think there's any point where we can say, look, let's just focus on one part of this process. We need to be looking all the way through selection, establishment, and management. So to start off with, why legumes? I've already mentioned those 2 points up the top. We want to improve diet quality, so we think about our legumes, they're quite high in crude protein. They certainly add a lot for our animal performance. But secondly, we can think about the fact that our legumes fix N. We've got legumes that are effective at taking atmospheric nitrogen, fixing that so it's available for plant growth. One thing I want to point out though, when we look at those two key components about legumes, is that we can't separate them. Yes, they're good for the animal. Yes, they're good for pasture. But we can't really separate those out as two different things. Because in a system where we are so effective at utilising crude protein for the animal, there's less that's going to be deposited as excreta, there's less cycling, there's actually less for the pasture component. So when we think about legumes in the system, it's quite a dynamic. Useful for animals, useful for pastures. We need to try and get that balance right. Now, given that our legumes are so good in these different areas, what that raises are a few key challenges. And I've just listed a few, and these aren't all of them. but a few to start us thinking, well, what is the challenge that we've got with legumes in our system? Firstly, if I've got something that's high quality, more palatable, I'm going to see it preferentially grazed. So if I'm not managing grazing effectively, I'd expect to see that legume component start to drop out of the system if I don't do something drastic about that. If we think about fixing nitrogen, it's great that our legumes do that, but it costs the plant. The plant actually has to put energy into fixing N. It's not a free thing. If there's enough N there for the legume, they'd rather take it up than make it themselves. So when we think about that, for the plant, there's a cost. And the other thing that you'll often hear about legumes is that their morphology is quite poor in many ways. Our root development isn't as good, and we'll talk about that soon, and we've got growing points that are exposed. A couple of generalisations, but quite often that's what we see, comparing our legumes to our grasses. So just very quickly, I want to ask the question, as we walk out into a pasture sward, what do we actually think about our plants doing in that sward? So I look at a sward and I'm thinking, I've got a whole diverse range of plants that are fighting as best they can for light and space above ground. And that's really what our plants are doing. I might have grasses, legumes, a range of different species competing against each other. There might be some weeds in there. There might be some native grasses. There's a whole complex range of species that might be in the sward. What our plants are doing above ground is trying as effectively as possible to compete for light and space. Now you might say, well, why is this important? The reason it's important is when we get down to our grazing management and how we actually manage our legumes, it always comes back to what our plants are trying to do. Our plants are trying to compete as effectively as possible to survive in the environment. Now, quite often when we think about our plants, we're always interested in the above ground because we can see it quite easily. That's where we're making our biomass, that's what we're grazing, and that's very useful. For me though, I've spent a lot of time, many hours, looking at below ground, roots, root length, root branching, to understand what our plants are trying to do within the environment. How are they responding to different parts of the environment? And there's a few key things that our plants are doing. We know from our soil we're chasing a couple of things. It's nutrients and it's water. Primarily that's what our plants are going for. So we need to develop roots that are very effective at foraging for nutrients. And when we think about nutrients, they're up in that top 5 to 10 centimetres. So when you think of your soil profile, however deep it is, most of your nutrients are up in those top 5 centimetres. So if we want a plant that's effective at foraging for nutrients, they need to be able to branch effectively in the topsoil. When we think about water acquisition though, the whole soil profile, or that whole bucket, becomes very important. And that's where our deeper roots are very useful. So when you think about a plant below ground, what it's trying to do is put out roots to get nutrients and water, and those things are often located in quite different places. Now, what I've got here are a couple of photos just to contrast between a grass and a legume. On that right-hand side over here, we've got digit grass, a common C4 grass grown around here. And on the right-hand side, we've got desmanthus, tropical legume. Now, when we think about what our grasses and legumes are trying to do, they're developing root length, they're trying to get long roots, ideally thin roots, and a lot of root hairs. What you'll notice is a big difference between our grass and our legume in how effectively they're developing roots, whether it be root length, root hairs, you name it. The grass is very good at developing root length and root hairs. Now on the right-hand side, I've got a little video, it only goes for about 20 seconds. But before I start it, what I want to point out, on the left-hand side, we've got our digit grass. On our right-hand side, we've got our desmanthus. I think this is about 10 days after planting. So we're starting 10 days after the seeds are in the ground. We've had emergence. And the video starts from there. And I just want you to observe the difference between the grass and the legume as they grow. Now, there's a range of different things going on in that video, quite a few things that interest me. Firstly, you can see how quickly that grass is able to develop root length that is effectively foraging that soil. A big problem when we're trying to get a grass and a legume sown at the same time. How do we do that effectively? Another thing that's quite interesting, and this should interest Sean, when you watch the video, you can see the grass is actually drying down on that moisture in that band where that nutrition is. So there's all these things going on below the soil surface that are really driving production. And the more we understand about this, I would say the better. So that's the context. We've got plants that are trying to compete effectively for light, for space, for nutrients, and for water. And now the question is, how do we use our understanding of what plants are doing to actually answer some questions? And I'm just going to quickly step through selection, through to establishment, and then finally management, and just give you a few key things, or the way I look at it. And there's plenty of other people in the room here who could answer questions about this kind of stuff. And some of this is taken from work that Sean and Lester have done previously. And what I'm trying to do is pull it all together just to provide a bit of a framework. How do we understand legume growth in the environment? To start off with selection, how do we choose what species we want to grow? For me, there's a really clear scaffold that we work on. Number one is climate. Number two is soil type. Number three is going to be what you're wanting to do in terms of management. So that might be trying to pair different species. It might be trying to reduce bloat risk. It might be trying to match in some part of your system that you're trying to maximize growth or shift growth. But I always go climate, soils, down into management type. And following that is very important. When I think climate, on the left-hand side over there, I've just got that map which shows our average rainfall for the northwest or into the tablelands as well. Obviously, there's quite a range in rainfall across that environment. But if I'm located in a particular part of that environment, let's say that gets 600 mils of rain per year, I'm very interested to know what that amount of annual rainfall is, because that's largely going to determine, is my legume going to persist in that environment? But one point I want to pick up on that Sean made earlier was this year-to-year variability is actually quite important. If we look at an area where we say we get 600 mils of rain, but half the time it's below that, the other half it's above that, if we're selecting a species that is supposedly suited to 600 mils, but half the time we're actually spending below that amount of annual average rainfall, our likeliness for persistence isn't going to be great. So when you look at those annual average rainfall targets, just be a little bit careful to understand, well, what kind of leeway have I got? Yes, I might average 600 mils. Yes, this plant needs 600 mils. But what happens in the years where I'm only getting 450, 500, and if I get that over consecutive years? The next thing is soil type. And here I've just got the map showing our range of soils, a huge range of soils in the area that we're looking at here. Soil type is very important. And what I thought I'd do, this is a very basic schematic. Don't take this as these are the only species that I recommend. This is just me doing a very quick, let's look at a couple of different scenarios. So let's say we are in an area that receives 600 mils. And I then think, well, what kind of species might be suitable to that area? I then want to think about, well, what soils have I got? Is it a sandy soil that's quite acidic? Or am I looking at a loam to a clay soil that's more neutral? Because those kind of things have quite a large impact on the likeliness for persistence out of my legumes. Now, just out of interest, for the current adoption and extension project that we've got at UNE, all about adopting legumes, these are some of the legumes that we're finding are quite successful across the northwest. So this isn't a random selection, but it's not a complete selection. So if we're looking at quite a light soil type where acidity is likely to be a problem, we are seeing good success with our Ceredellas, our Bicerula, and our Rose Clover. Those species that are quite suited to those conditions. On the other hand, if we think about our heavier soils, where we've got much heavier soil types, a better water holding capacity, more nutrients, and a higher pH, we're then shifting across to another suite of legumes, like our Medix, our Lucin, our Desmanthus, and they're becoming quite important in those environments. The question is always asked though, why or how do I choose what I choose? Because in this range of just 8, I've got some that are annual, some that are perennial, some that have got quite long growing seasons, others that are quite short. There's differences in hard seededness, there's differences in bloat risk. And that's where my third part of the selection criteria comes in. We've got climate first, we've got soil second, and then I've got all these other questions for management component third, where I'm asking, well, what am I trying to achieve in my system? Do I want an annual legume or a perennial legume? What's my bloat risk like? How am I going to manage that? If I go for an annual legume, what am I wanting to try and achieve in terms of hard-seededness? Just as a quick comment now, and I will touch on this shortly again, if we are going for an annual legume, you really need an annual legume around here that's quite a short growing season, and it needs to have a pretty good level of hard-seededness as a general rule of thumb. So we're starting to match up these characteristics to make sure we actually get persistence out of our legumes. On to establishment. My first point up the top is, I suppose, very apparent, and I'm sure I don't need to say too much about that. When I say preparation, 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 I'm thinking of things like, I know the soil type I'm going into. I've got my weeds under control. I've got my seed ready. I know it's high quality. All of those kind of basic things. That's what I'm assuming there in terms of preparation. And we can't cut corners when it comes to those kind of things. So I'm assuming all of that out of the gate. What I want to quickly comment on, though, are these other things like timing, placement, and amendments that are very important for legumes. And I thought the best way of doing that was to briefly consider two scenarios that I've listed down the bottom, because they are quite different scenarios. So if you're based in the northwest and you've got a C4 grass currently and you're thinking, well, what kind of legume could I get in? You might be thinking, well, let's go with a temperate annual legume that grows over winter. Or you might be thinking, let's go in, I haven't got any improved pastures, let's go in with a C4 grass with a perennial legume like lucerne. So they're the two scenarios I want to think about, because depending on the scenario, largely determines what you're going to do in terms of timing, placement, and amendments. Amendments not so much. I'd obviously recommend make sure you get your rhizobia, and starter fertiliser is always valuable. But when you think about timing and placement, those things are largely determined by the scenario you're in. So let's take the first scenario, a warm season perennial legume, so let's say lucerne, and we're wanting to sow that with a C4 grass, let's say digit. How are we going to do that? The thing I want to do with those species is understand when are they going to be growing at their, or likely to emerge and grow at their peak. And that comes back to timing, temperature and moisture. The key thing that I'm trying to achieve around establishment is get those plants out of the ground quickly and achieve canopy closure quickly. The sooner I can achieve canopy closure, the less time there is for weeds to come in and actually infest that pasture. So I want to make sure I'm planting at a time which is suitable for those species. So let's say up around here for digit and lucerne, there's a bit of wriggle room, I suppose, but let's say we go October, November. You're going to have much more success, I suppose, then than if you were to say, let's go in June, July, when we're not going to get growth out of those species. So first thing I'm trying to understand is, when are those species going to be growing based on temperature and moisture? So that's the timing component. But when I think about lucerne and digit, the other thing I know about those two species is that they're largely wanting to compete at the same time for the same resources. So I've talked about light, space, nutrients, and water. They are really wanting to go for those things at a pretty similar time of year. If that's the case, I need to be quite careful in terms of how I'm going to plant those down. So whether they're going down the same slot in the drill, we've done a fair bit of work looking at alternating, going grass, legume, and we've had a fair bit of success with that. Obviously that takes a bit more setup, but it's quite successful in terms of spacing our plants out to allow them to actually have time to do what they need to do, particularly when a legume is quite slow to establish. If we take our other example though, a winter annual legume into a C4 grass, we're assuming we've got an established digit pasture, let's say, and we want to amend that or get a legume component into that. So if I'm thinking a winter annual legume, it's likely I'll be thinking, let's get in March, April, sometime around that time of the year, to get my temperate, my winter annual legume into that system for very similar reasons, because that's when that legume is going to be most successful at emerging and starting to grow. The difference though, down here, is that our grass and our legume are doing similar things, but at different times of the year. So yes, they're still competing for the same things, But our legumes growing during winter, our grass is growing during summer, and that's quite a different kettle of fish when we think about management. And that's what I want to finish up on this morning, are some ideas about how we actually manage these things, given some of these differences. What I've done is I've taken the Evergraze data that is available online, and I've replotted that myself just to try and simplify the graphs to highlight a couple of points. Because when you look at those feed supply graphs that you find online, usually we've got about 5 or 6 different species and we get the general trend. But what I wanted to do was really separate out a couple of key scenarios so we can really see what's going on. So that first scenario we were talking about, establishing a perennial legume like lucerne with digit, the growth of those species is shown there on the left-hand side. So I've just plotted up digit and lucerne. That's what we're expecting to see in terms of pasture growth throughout the year. What do we observe there? Doing similar things at the same time of year, but as some of Sue's and Sean's work has found, we do see that lucerne does tend to kick off a little bit sooner. So actually understanding those differences between our species becomes quite important. If I have a pretty decent winter like we've just had, and my lucerne is fired up, plenty of stored moisture, it's ready to go, and my digit's just 4 to 6 weeks later, I'm going to start to see a bit of an imbalance. So yes, they might be doing similar things at the same time of year, but there can be a bit of a difference there that means that I do need to manage quite effectively. So when I'm looking on the left-hand side at something like digit and lucerne, I'm wanting to understand, is there a time of year where one of them could get ahead of the other? It's at that time of the year I want to be quite careful in terms of my management, my grazing management. On the right-hand side, I've got our second scenario where we're looking at a digit grass with a winter annual legume. And here I've just got subclover. And again, I've done the same thing. I've plotted up what they're doing in terms of growth. And what do we observe there? It's pretty different, isn't it? So doing things at different times of the year. And that's actually quite useful in this environment around here, because if plants are doing things at different times of the year, it means they're not actively competing. However, what I've put on here is my own little embellishment, is that in my mind there are 2 key times of the year where we do need to be a bit careful how we manage that system. Yes, they're doing things at different times of the year, but subclover has to regenerate each year. The only way subclover is going to regenerate, and when I think subclovers, think the same thing for ceradella, rose clover, any of those winter annual legumes that you may have put into your pasture, they need to regenerate each year. To do that, I'm going straight back to that first principle about space and light. The only way my winter annual legume can regenerate, emerge at the start of that growing season, is if there's enough space in the canopy. The way we're doing that is managing grazing quite carefully when we're expecting to see emergence of those species. The other time of year where it's really important is at the back end. Our winter annual legumes, annual, it means that they need to set seed and then regenerate from seed. That means I need to be very careful about how I'm managing them at the back half to make sure there's adequate seed set. So you can see between 2 different systems, yes, there's growth at different times of the year, but the way I'm going to manage those 2 systems, quite different as well. And I suppose the question I want to pose to you is, how do you do that most effectively on your property if you've got legumes? And if you want to get into legumes, it's good to understand some of these kinds of things that should be considered before you go down that pathway. 2 very different scenarios. What I wanted to quickly comment on, and I hadn't talked to Sean at all about what he was going to talk about, and I just put this together last night just as a bit of an extra, is just to show some of the differences we can actually see, not only between seasons, but just across a season. That's particularly important if we have a summer growing grass and a winter growing legume. If we have a really good summer, so have a look on the right-hand side, we have a really good summer, heaps of rainfall. Our grass is going to go gangbusters, isn't it? Now the problem there is that if I've had a really good summer, but my carrying capacity or stocking rate hasn't changed too much, it's quite likely I'm going to have a large amount of biomass come into March, April. that's going to have quite an impact on the likeliness for my annual legume to actually regenerate. That's a management problem I need to consider. On the flip side, if we look at a dry summer but a wet winter, you can see that we've got a different problem. We've actually got a year where we've got a heap of legume growth, and if we go back to understanding what our legumes are doing, one of the key things is it's fixing N, and in this kind of season, the amount of N that's actually fixed and is going to be available for our grass is quite different to a standard year. So when you look at year-to-year variation, but even within season variation, that actually has quite a big impact on how we're going to manage our system. When we don't have much legume growth over winter, the likeliness of an application of N over summer being useful is quite high, less likely in this kind of scenario where there's a bit of a change or an imbalance. The other thing I wanted to comment on is just the importance of recovery. This photo here is just of two of our tropical legumes. We've got Desmanthus on the left-hand side, Stylo, Katinga Stylo on the right-hand side. We were doing a bit of work trying to understand the impact of cutting, so how frequently, simulating grazing, how frequently and also how intense that grazing was. And you can see as we go across these pots, there's quite a change in how they're responding to that treatment. And as we go from left to right, what we're getting is 10 days rotation to 20 to 30 to 40, all the way up to 60. So what we're seeing there is the benefit of an additional 10 days as we go across those pots. And you can see in both cases that there's a little bit of recovery, but not a huge amount. But particularly here, as we get across to about 40 days, that's where we really start to see more recovery. Now, I know this is quite an isolated example, but the reason I want to highlight that is that we can't assume that every species has the same grazing requirement. We can't go in and think our winter annual legumes, our lucerne, our Desmanthus, our Stylos, they all just need a certain amount of rest. It's really important to actually go out and try and understand as effectively as possible what kind of rotation is actually suitable for the species that you're growing in your pasture sward. So I don't have all the answers here to list off today, but I just want to highlight that we just can't assume that all legumes are the same and their requirements are the same. Which does lead into the next part of our management component. When I think about management, there's a couple of key things that we can do in our pasture system. Number one, like we've just been talking, is grazing. Number two is how we manage soil fertility. And when I think about legumes, there's a couple of key players in my mind that when I get my soil test back, I'm always looking for. We're thinking about Colwell P, we're thinking about our KCl40, so our sulphur, and we're thinking about our pH. By and large, they're the three key things that I'm wanting to look at to understand what my soil is doing. So I can then either select the appropriate species or apply fertiliser as required. Now, given phosphorus is such an important nutrient, it's useful to consider that there are quite a range of phosphorus requirements across our legumes. This here is just focusing on our winter legumes. And if you go to the MLA website, the work that Richard Simpson and Rebecca Haling and co have done, they've gone through a whole range of winter annual legumes trying to understand what their critical phosphorus requirements are. Now, when I talk critical phosphorus requirement, I'm thinking, where do I achieve 90 to 95% of maximum yield? How much fertiliser do I need to apply to achieve that? So it's essentially understanding how much phosphorus do I need in my soil to ensure that my system is productive. Now, in a traditional system where we've looked at subclover, you'll often hear that we aim for a critical Colwell of about 30 to 35. And you can see that's where our subclover is sitting up there. But some of the other legumes that I've talked about and you'll hear about in passing are things like our Cerodellas, our rose clover, and you can see that they have a much lower critical requirement. So rather than requiring 32 or so, down here we can see for our French Cerodella we're about 20, 21. Actually understanding the difference in critical requirement is very important for actually managing the system. There's no point trying to manage a Cerodella system like a subclover system and vice versa. We need to understand what those requirements are for the legumes that we're growing. Just a quick point about how our species actually respond to fertiliser. That video that I showed you before is the same as the one I've got in the middle there. So that photo in the middle, again, we've got our digit and desmanthus, and what we've done is applied fertiliser to both of our species. So they've both got an equivalent amount of fertiliser below them at planting. On the left-hand side, what we've done is we've applied no fertiliser to our digit, and we've applied it only to our legume. On the right-hand side, we've applied it only to the digit and not to our legume. Straight away you can see that there's quite a response there in terms of what our plants are doing with that nutrition. The reason I raise this is particularly when we think about species that are actively competing. So if we think digit lucerne, digit desmanthus, those kind of combinations, we need to be a little bit careful in terms of how we apply our nutrition to make sure we actually benefit that legume component. In a fair bit of our work, what we're finding is, particularly around phosphorus, if you're not careful with that starter fertiliser, you can actually advantage the grass a little bit too much so that it gets ahead and far too far ahead and your legume just can't catch up. So you go into the system thinking, yes, we need starter fertiliser, and that's good. But I suppose my warning there is just to be careful that when you apply your fertiliser, you're not inadvertently advantaging the grass to the detriment of the legume. That's particularly important in a very tricky scenario if we've got an established C4 grass already growing and we try and put a perennial legume into that system. If we've already got an established grass which is already competing for light, space, nutrients and water, we add a legume and add a bit of fertiliser, guess which plant is going to access that nutrition first? It's a plant that's there, it's growing, accessing more moisture. So we need to be a little bit careful how we manage that. A couple of key considerations, because I assume I have well and truly gone over time. These are just some basic principles that are useful take-home messages. Number one, think about species that actually suit each other and then manage them accordingly. So when I go into a system, I'm trying to understand, are the species I'm selecting going to pair appropriately? I don't want two species that are so different and yet growing at the same time of year that I can't effectively manage them. We need to be looking at species that pair effectively. Quite often what we find is that our grasses are going to out-yield our legumes. It's not always the case, but quite often is the case. And that's where our grazing management comes in. We need to be very careful that we're managing effectively so that we don't end up with the grass component overwhelming the legume component. And that's a bit about understanding what our grasses and legumes are doing at particular times of the year. In general, our legumes require more nutrition, and that's particularly the case for our temperate annuals. What that means is that when you come to manage your soil fertility, you need to be managing for the legume component. It's not a case of grass needs this, legume needs this, let's split it halfway. We actually need to be managing effectively for the legume component. If it has a critical requirement for phosphorus of 30, our grass only needs 20, guess what? It's 30 that we need in that system to actually maintain the legume. And then finally, and this is just a point about understanding below the surface, think about what's actually going on. If I've got a clay pan or I've got acidic soil, 20, 30, 40 centimetres below that surface, that has a big impact on what my plants can do. We're assuming our plants are foraging for nutrients, they're foraging for water, they're going down deep for water. If there's not actually that space for them to grow in, that has a big impact on what's going on in the system. What I want to leave you with in terms of legumes is that they require active management. And I suppose management in definition should be active, but when you think about legumes, I just want you to think about it that they do need active management. There aren't many systems where you can throw a legume in there and they just go and care for themselves. There's a few, but by and large that's not the case. The reason why we keep getting questions nearly every year about how do we manage for legumes is for that very reason. We can't just set and forget when it comes to that composition of grasses and legumes. And I've talked about a range of different things, and I do want to highlight that, in my opinion, getting your selection right, getting establishment right, and managing appropriately is all part and parcel of actually getting productive and persistent legumes. It's not just get the right species, the rest will take care of itself, or I'll throw in whatever I can find, let's just manage as best I can. We do actually need to go through each of those three steps and say, yep, we're selecting the right legume, we're establishing it appropriately, we're also managing it appropriately as well. That's all I've got. Thank you.